Great.
Good.
Great. Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry it's virtual and not in person. But yeah, I wish I could be there. I've heard really great things about the course. So, Greg, maybe one day I can be fly on the wall and sit in on one of these. So that'd be great.
No, that'd be awesome.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, and you are loud and clear. And you may say
Okay.
you may see me jump in front of the screen if there's a question in the audience. We try to make it as interactive as possible, even with Zoom.
Okay, great.
Actually, I'm not any questions.
I was actually going to ask that. So I don't like presentations or talking heads. So if anybody has a question, maybe Greg, you can shout out on their behalf if they're too polite. Happy to stop, answer any questions, run through some case studies. I have a couple of slides that I thought could just guide this conversation. But perhaps let's start by introducing myself. So my name is Catherine Lukov. I am the co-founder and CEO for a company called 2050. We build AI and cloud-powered solutions. We very proudly work with 3 of the largest retailers on the continent, some of the banks and mobile phone companies. And I have the amazing job of wrangling smart, interesting humans to build cool stuff. If this wasn't being recorded, I probably would have used a different word, but yeah. So we are based in Cape Town, South Africa, although our team is completely remote, hence you're in my home office today. And yeah, we have a team of developers and service designers and data scientists and UI designers and just really great, smart, interesting people. So today, Greg's asked me to come and chat to you about some of the case studies we worked on, specifically around how AI is used in data. And I thought maybe I'd take you a little bit through the process of how we approach projects, specifically digital innovation projects with some of our larger clients. So feel free to pick any questions. I specifically am not.
Sorry, just pause, please.
Can the slides be shared, or must we take a picture that you mind?
Do you mind if they take pictures of slides, or if you're going to share them, or are you happy to share?
I'm very happy to share them, no problem. You're welcome to take pictures too, but I'm also happy to share them.
Awesome.
I'm specifically not in slideshow mode because I am going to be toggling out a couple of tools that I think might be really useful in your day-to-day life. So yeah, firstly, I think it's really important to introduce you to a philosophy that we really adopt within 2050. There's a chap by the name of Gianni Giacomelli who is head of the MIT Collective Intelligence community. And they speak of a concept of augmented collective intelligence. And it's something that's resonated with us from the get-go. And we've always kind of said that the best way to build solutions is to bring human ingenuity and machine kind of intelligent technology together. And that has really kind of served us extremely well because we're not, although we're an AWS partner, we're very specific about the right tools for the job. And I think that's a topic that you'll see as we go through this presentation will come up time and time again. The second thing that we're really clear on is that an innovation isn't always a flying car or ChatGPT. It can be just a different way in which a process is approached. It can be a small incremental change. It can be an automation within a business that saves time, or it could be, you know, finding a whole new vaccine using AlphaFold. So at the end of the day, we approach innovation incrementally because we find that it's easier to change minds and win hearts and minds, if you like, if you're bringing innovation into a business incrementally and slowly. It is always very scary when things change, and we try to find ways in which we understand the business problem up front, work our way backwards, and figure out what a phased approach could be to bringing innovation and change into that business. So I'm specifically a fan of Linda Hill. I'm very happy to share one of her talks she does on innovation in the links, which I'll include in the presentation after. So we specifically work within the tech space. We use technology to solve problems. I will definitely give you an overview of what those problems actually consist of. And I should probably be clear that I don't code to save my life. I have a whole team of developers, and they certainly interpret kind of the more technical side of things for me. But where myself and our product lead and our operations managers and our UI people excel is really understanding how do you take a complex problem and then interpret that both on the business strategy side as well as on the developer side, so that you can come up with a solution that's not only elegant, but that can scale and that can really solve the problem long run. And most importantly, that a company can then ultimately maintain and support themselves. So that's really important. What I want to point out is what innovation is not. It is not your boss or your board member or your investor asking you to build them a ChatGPT. This happens a lot. We've recently had a client come to us and say they desperately want to use Gen AI. And I said, okay, but for what? Why do you want to use it? No, we want to personalize our marketing messages. So there are a couple of steps that are involved in doing something like that, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar, especially after the last 2 days, about tools like Midjourney and DALL-E, where you can create images. Even Adobe Acrobat now allows, Adobe's photo suite now allows you to create your own images. You're obviously all familiar with things like ChatGPT and Claude and so forth, where you can generate content. But at the end of the day, if you don't understand who your audience is and who you're actually generating that content for, you're still stuck. And that really is ultimately where that data portion is going to come in. The other thing to consider is that things like Gen AI might be really exciting. Everybody wants to use it. It's still extremely expensive and is not necessarily always the right tool for the job. I'll give you a great example. There's a phenomenal company called Turn On the Subtitles, TOTS for short. And what they've discovered is that by adding literacy grade subtitles to children's content, they can have children actually become, well, they're twice as likely to become literate. So they've reached over 400 million children already, beg your pardon, in India, across the UK, the US, etc. Their biggest challenge is how do they create more literacy grade subtitles? Their hope was that they could use Gen AI for it, but ultimately actually using something like Amazon Transcribe, which is just machine learning instead, is a much better option for them to use. Why? Well, it's cheaper. They can essentially train their own models and help those models understand whether a word is contextually correct, spelling is correct, the timestamps are correct, etc. And so they can add these subtitles that they license out to the broadcasters, add it to the children's content, and these kids sit there and read all day and ultimately have the opportunity to become more literate. They're going to be rolling out in Africa or more widely in Africa soon, and they're trying to see how they can actually use tools like Amazon Transcribe to be able to do that moving forward so that they can do it at large scale. I know that you've covered most likely, and Greg, I looked at your content. Have you covered off the objectives just of key AI strategies, or can I run through a few of those again?
I think it's very useful to go through these because we didn't kind of get this right. We didn't talk anything about customer experience. So yeah, please.
Okay, great. So these are just the 2 slides of this that I want to run through. The reason I'm doing it is that every single project we approach, regardless of what the challenge is, we start trying to understand just a few aspects. What are the business requirements? What are the user requirements? And ultimately, how does that problem fit within a larger societal and ecosystem environment? One example of that would be if we are going to be automating a specific task, and it turns out that we're taking away a tremendous amount of time, in other words, saving a company a tremendous amount of time, what would the impact of that be on their workforce? How would they upskill that workforce? How would they be deploying them to use them more creatively? So we take a look from the get-go at what are the business objectives and what are the customer objectives. And then we try and understand from a project perspective, what are they trying to drive? And it could be a combination of these. Are they trying to drive innovation? Is it around operational efficiency? Are they trying to improve their customer experience? And if so, why? And more importantly, are they actually asking the customers what it is that they want? They're obviously a big one. They're also looking at data-driven decision-making. So I'll give you a few examples of that in a moment. We certainly look at whether you can gain a competitive advantage. And ultimately, how much money should you be spending on this particular solution in order to gain that advantage? Just a side note here, we were asked a few years ago by one of the local retailers to review their version of Amazon's Just Walk Out. And they were having challenges. I'm sure everybody's seen the news where really the Amazon technology was just powered by a couple of thousand people in India who were observing the
Yes.
technology when it actually being implemented.
Yes,
So-
Catherine, we were talking about the case yesterday. There's like, hey, walk into Amazon
brilliant.
supermarket and you can just walk in and check out. And then I said they shut it down. But what I actually picked up only last night was that actually there's no AI behind it. And as Catherine just said, there's 1,000 or 2,000 people in India, and they're manually doing stuff. So the challenge was, why is my receipt taking 4 hours to be emailed? Those kinds of things. So it's all smoke and mirrors. So Amazon shut down the project. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Catherine.
Not at all. There's actually a really great article this morning. I'll find it for you. Trying to remember the source now, but it's 11 or 12 different innovations that they claimed were actual like automation, but where real humans were involved. Sorry for the visual effects there. That's interesting, and that obviously speaks to a whole different topic. It speaks around ethics and trust. It speaks around just, other, in this instance, I know of organizations or startups who try to copy the Just Walk Out technology, built their entire business on that, tried to then get retailers and other companies to buy into that technology. And of course, no one could ever reach the success that Amazon claimed they reached. And as a result, quite a lot of money, time, and energy was wasted. So just, again, speaking to that competitive advantage, I think sometimes it's important to look at, do you want to build something yourself? If why? Or does something already exist that we can use that we don't have to start from scratch? Go ahead, Greg.
So sorry to interrupt you. That was very rude of me. So there's the traditional kind of AI ethics. If a bot is serving you, or if AI is generating a marketing agency's content for a company, they need to disclose that we had AI involved in this. You're talking about the opposite, whereas they say it's AI and it's actually real people.
Exactly.
Wow.
And as a result of that, they're trying to sell that technology, but of course, never really being able to deliver on it. So actually their focus is now on something called Dashcart. This is Amazon specifically. It's a trolley that includes a QR scanner in the trolley, and you basically, as you drop things into your trolley, it's scanning what you've bought, and you can walk out to your car and you've already essentially paid for it by the time you've left without using a teller. But yeah, interesting to see how they were pushing for Just Walk Out, pulled back from that, and specifically started the conversations around Dashcart about 2 years ago, instead of bringing that technology out. Now we know why. So I'm not impressed. It's yeah, I think it's time and energy wasted that they could have saved a lot of people. Oh, and Libby, do you have a question? No, okay. 2 more points I think that are really key to consider if you're going to embark on any project, let alone an AI project. In this case, specifically the mitigation of risks, and just responsible AI. I'm sure that's the topic that's also come up for you. Here, we're really looking at what are the frameworks that need to be addressed. So last year in June, I led a panel at Arctic 15 in Helsinki on building, scaling, and investing in AI. And one of the biggest questions that came up specifically for the VC on the panel was, how are they enforcing frameworks for their startups? Now, it's a question that comes up for startups all the time. Every time they try and raise money because they have an AI-enabled startup, they're essentially asked, what responsible AI are you deploying? But similarly, I think that question should be asked to big organizations the world over. Which tools are you using? How are you enabling your teams to actually use those tools? How are you ensuring your data security? So, for example, not uploading all of your content into ChatGPT. How are you ensuring that the people are being honest and truthful about the AI tools that they are using? How do you know that the data that is being used you have consent for? So that speaks to a whole consent preference management platform and a customer data platform. So those are just some of the things that I think are really, really important. We have said no to jobs where people have asked us to essentially replace their entire human workforce. Simply not interested. And I think it speaks to building what matters and making sure that your strategy aligns with the greater good. But ultimately, I think more and more companies are going to be asked what their frameworks are, whether those align to things like the AI framework out of the EU, or even what South Africa is trying to put in place. I think very similar to how POPI has been implemented in GDPR, we're going to see regulations step in for us as companies building and also for those companies adopting. And then finally, I referenced this.
Catherine, sorry to interrupt. Just to give you context, this is a wonderful slide. It's encompassing everything we've been talking about over the last 8 minutes. At the top, competitive advantage and strategy and competitive strategy. We covered that in the morning yesterday, first half. Second half of the morning, we talked about reskilling workforce, and that's kind of been a continuing thing. Monisha just spoke to us on GRC and risk management and responsible AI. Johan Stein is coming after lunch, and he'll be talking about responsible AI and ethics. So kind of encompassing everything here is really, really cool.
Okay, great. Well, we'll get to the data part in a sec, so magic. Before we dig into data, I think there's one more thing that I want to reference that really encompasses everything I've mentioned up until this point. So firstly, understanding a problem. What is the problem you're solving? Why are you solving for it? Is it simply because a board member's asked for AI to be included, or do you really feel that it can move the needle? Then again, when you are doing it, which tools are you choosing? Because cost implications and data implications and security implications remain very real. And then, as I've mentioned before, what are your business requirements, your technology requirements, your customer requirements, and also your societal requirements? When we're able to, we try and run a full service design project ahead of any implementation project. So we'll take a look at the current state. What is the problem right now? Who does it affect? What do users have to say about it? Who needs within the organization needs to be informed and consulted? What are the frameworks, et cetera, and then we do a full future state design. What is the right technology? What are the product features? Which tools and integrations are we going to have to consider? What are our security concerns? How do we scale this in the future? How do you make it future fit, et cetera, et cetera? So if it's not an approach you're familiar with, there's tremendous amount of reading online available on service design, and really will stand you in good stead if you're considering implementing any kind of new technology for that matter. Before I move on to data, does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to throw out there?
One of the things I really appreciate is that, because we talked about in the strategic frameworks and kind of like the kind of demystifying AI is the avoiding the kind of default to FOMO in your decision making. So you talked about the Amazon retail experience, and all these retailers jumped on the bandwagon to try to replicate it, and it has cost them tons of money, right?
Yeah, huge amounts of money and time that could have been spent elsewhere.
Exactly. The other is the strategic approach, so avoiding bright, shiny objects, determine what you want to do, why you want to do it, what you're hoping to achieve, all those kind of things is really resonating with the theme of the overall masterclass. So thank you for that.
Welcome. I think it is perhaps just take a minute to also say that instances like the Just Walk Out technology with Amazon, I would like to say is rare. It is certainly rare from organizations like Amazon. And I don't think that it should instill a level of fear in people of not wanting to try things. But I certainly think understanding who you're dealing with and being able to verify that the tool you're going to use actually works is really important. We currently are in discussions with a company who have very repeatable processes. So essentially, by mapping each of those repeatable processes, they should be able to automate those. Except they want to take it one step further, and they want to be able to do it by using something like OpenDevin, which is a single prompt code generator. So it's fairly useful if you're a non-coder and you want to create, let's say, a calculator app. You can type in calculator app and it will go through the steps and it will create a calculator app for you. However, if you're dealing with your own internal business processes and data, using a single prompt app like OpenDevin really opens you up for a number of kind of concerns. Firstly, the code for those, the code for the tools you're using are generally open source. So there are no cost implications, but you don't necessarily know in the future how they're going to change. If you open yourself up to someone typing a prompt in on, let's say, your prompt tool on your website, they can essentially also inject malicious code in that and effectively bring your entire organization to a standstill. Thirdly, if you look at it from a user perspective, you might understand what a good solution looks like for your customer, but that customer might be trying to put, I don't know, a camel and a zebra together and think that they're going to come up with a whole new solution when you know that that's not really a feasible solution. You're also going to struggle in the long term with your own IP and how do you scale it? How do you write documentation, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm giving you quite a detailed example, but there are tools out there that you could use where you're trying to do things too quickly and actually you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. And back to the previous comment, Greg, waste a whole lot of time, money, and energy trying to do it. Okay, I think it's important to, although this is boring for most people because data doesn't excite everybody, I think it's important to take a look just at some of the data types out there and why they're important. Most of you might be familiar with some or all of these. The first is structured data. So it's everything from a well-defined format, spreadsheets, databases, and so forth. This is the type of data that you would use in let's say, for example, you build a retail data lake. You'll be reading your POS data tables and your master data tables, and essentially that would be considered structured data. Whereas if you look at unstructured data, it's pretty much the majority of the data available out there. So that's things like video content, text content, in other words, things that aren't necessarily repeatable that you can reuse, but that you have to infer what the context of that data is. There's obviously also time series data. Here that's used for things like measurements of the weather. I wish it was applicable to the lottery because I'd love to win the Powerball. But yeah, time series data. So stock prices, weather measurements, and so forth. And then textual data. So in this instance, data that's being used for NLP techniques, social media posts, logs, tweets, etc., etc. Some of the other data that's out there is image and visual data. So here we look at things like medical scans. Some of my favorite examples, and there's actually an article about it this morning, is how you can help radiologists review x-rays faster. One of my favorite use cases for that, sadly, COVID put an end to it, but we were dealing with an organization just before COVID hit. And these people had 4 petabytes of data. There was annotated data for African skin types, but for cancer slides. So one of the hardest things for doctors to do is to reach a differential diagnosis in a quick enough time where they can help save customers' patients. So these guys had slides that had been taken of skin lesions for however many years, and they essentially wanted to upload that into a model and be able to stain that model with different colors to show up all the different variances of what that skin lesion might be. And they wanted to use that model to reach a differential diagnosis, specifically on African skin types, because they had all this labeled data and they were able to do it. But yeah, sadly, as I say, they went under because COVID hit. But that's just a great way in which visual data can be used to really enhance people's lives and help doctors do more and not necessarily put people out of jobs. So I love that. There's also audio data. Here in this instance, I'm pretty sure anyone here who uses Spotify or Apple Music uses their recommendation engines. You now also get some really cool companies out there that actually are creating musical content so that it can be used in ads and blog posts and TV programs and movies and so forth. Of course, you've probably all seen the riots from the artists across the world and from screenwriters that aren't particularly happy about that. But rights-free content is where, if you wanted to create rights-free content, that's where you need audio data. Sensor data, particularly for the retailers in the room, here, anything from your fridges to sensors in your trucks. I know SAB, for example, was using a company called CERT a few years back, where they were inserting sensors into the doors of SAB fridges across Africa. And the types of predictive modeling they could do, how many times the fridge door is being opened, how warm the temperature of the fridge is, would give you an indication of not only how empty or full the fridge is, but whether it's recently been restocked. The number of times the door opens can give you an indication of how soon you need to restock that fridge, etc. So some interesting use cases around IoT data. And then, of course, behavioral data. So one of my favorite use cases, one I still need to find someone brave enough to try, but is if you can, we did this for Ster-Kinekor a while back, not in the same instance, but So Kinnickle were having issues where people would buy a ticket, go into the movie, wait for the next movie to start, and come out after the second movie, right? Easy enough to do.
I never did that growing up, ever. Also never snuck in through the exits. Never.
They wanted to both know, can they recognize whether the people who went in also came out? And then can they do some guesswork around how much more popcorn should they be making based on the number of humans in the forecourt? And so you can use gait recognition for that. And one of the things I think would be super interesting to try is, if you're a shopper like me, which I hate shopping, FYI, you walk into a store, you look at something and you walk out again, and you may go back a week later or 2 weeks later. Would I be able to recognize that it's the same person that's come back? And would I then be able to say, well, it took them 3 or 4 times of coming back or walking through my store before they actually picked up an item? I don't necessarily know who the person is, but I can start getting an idea for the footfall that goes into my store versus the number of sales I'm making. So yeah, behavioral data, how people are acting, sentiment analysis. So can I do sentiment analysis for people in a queue and understand if they're happy or miserable, and I should send a manager out to assist them before they have a meltdown. Anyway, so that's just some of the types of data that can be used, that is used, and perhaps just some of the use cases in which that can be applied. Cool. Before I get into case studies, I think there are 2 more things just specifically around data that we look at. The first is internal data, pretty self-explanatory. Any data that's created within your organization that you're able to use and have access to. And then there's also intrinsic data. So that's not something that's generated internally, but rather understanding voice recognition patterns, understanding facial recognition patterns, language processing systems, etc. This is all data that AI models are using to actually effectively do the jobs that we instruct them to do, right? And here you may be familiar with the discussion, but companies, for example, OpenAI and Anthropic and Google are all trying to understand where they can get more both training data from, but also data that they can then effectively extract that intrinsic data from. So I thought it was just worthwhile mentioning it, that there are kind of 2 types of data involved when you're starting to put these models together. Okay, let's talk use cases. We have been involved in quite a fair number of projects around data monetization. Everyone always wants to understand how they can monetize their data, and whether their data is actually monetizable. I'm going to give you one example within the retail sector. So I know everybody in this room is not retail, but forgive me, we work with a lot of retailers. So these are the examples I can give you. If let's say, for example, anybody here drinks Sterry Stumpies? I'm a huge Sterry Stumpy fan. Or a beer? Okay, any product. If you are the brand manager for Sterry Stumpy or for a Bar One, you essentially, initially upfront, your operations team need to understand how much stock is in the warehouse, how much stock is on the shelf, and how quickly they need to be able to replenish, right? So operational logistics of getting product into store. From there, there's POS data. So very simplistically put, essentially how many Sterry Stumpies did I sell on any given day, and which store, in which region, etc. And then ultimately that brand manager wants to be able to take that data and say, okay, what is my shopper loyalty for Sterry Stumpy in Limpopo? Or which other products was my Sterry Stumpy sold with most often? Perhaps it was a Bar One. And then be able to take that data, shopper loyalty, cross-shopping products, product association, cross-shopping stores, etc., and be able to put a media campaign together to drive more sales of that product, either in the regions where they're already doing well or in underperforming regions. And so the ability to then close that loop back out, once you know that you've been doing more marketing, you can start with your logistical and operational efforts once again to be able to drive that through. So the success of this has been something that we've watched quite a few of our clients try and in many cases succeed in. And the specific reasons why, and this doesn't just apply to retail, but why they want to look at data monetization is fairly simple. It's obviously always additional revenue. It's being able to maximize an asset that they already have. There's a competitive advantage, of course. The example I just gave, being able to drive more sales is one of them. being able to adapt to market trends. So being able to see how your monetization strategy can kind of essentially give you insights into where other areas of your business, where data can become more available, and what the preferences and shifts are in those markets. Long-term sustainability, I'm sure everybody's trying to find more money everywhere, but particularly important in kind of the landscape as it continues to change, and then improved customer experience. Because with better data and better insights, you can do more personalization and offer better customer experiences. That for us has been kind of some of the biggest drivers as to why we look at it. That said, not everybody is in a position to monetize their data, because it entirely depends on how well your data is structured, whether you have, for example, a data lake that you're able to reference, whether your team is knowledgeable and able to gain extract those insights and actually turn them into actionable strategies, whether your data is clean or not, whether you have the permission to use some of that data. Here, I'm again thinking of any data under POPI and GDPR, etc. But yeah, let's look at some case studies, unless anyone has a question. I'm throwing a lot of words at you, so I thought I'd give you
Yeah, let's
try.
pause some questions.
She's speaking about that clean data and unstructured data. So what would be the difference between the two?
Between structured and what? Sorry.
Between structured and unstructured data.
So
Oh.
unstructured and she's talking about like clean data, right?
Yeah.
So what is clean data and then how is it different from unstructured? Can unstructured data be like clean data as well?
So can unstructured data be clean as well? So you talked about the dirty and clean data and then structured and unstructured data. So can you unpack that matrix a little bit? That makes sense?
Absolutely. So think of structured data, anything that sits in a table or a spreadsheet, right? It's always repeatable. You always expect the data to be in the same place. Whereas unstructured data could be like video content. You don't know what's in it. You don't know. I mean, if you're a bank, for argument's sake, and you want to use video data to understand if someone is loitering outside of an ATM and whether that person has been loitering for too long, etc. You know, that's a very different use case to being able to look up data in a spreadsheet. Clean data ultimately depends mostly on its labeling, right? So a lot of people are storing all their data and not necessarily understanding what data is required. We spend a lot of time mapping data sets, who the users are, where they're coming from, what it's being used for, what the rules and regulations are around how that data can be implemented. Essentially writing scripts so that you can extract and transform and load that data into something like a data lake, and then essentially be able to reference back using Athena or QuickSight to query your own data. So when we talk about clean and unclean data, if you like, it's essentially, is there data that's already been, that is being treated in a similar manner, for which rules are being applied, for which labeling is being completed, and for which you're categorizing that data, and you're able to pull that data into a full data model. Mostly clean data is, most organizations will have less clean data than clean. However, the minute you start actually building out ETL frameworks and you can pull that in, you have a much better chance to ensure that your data is being treated and labeled accordingly. The other unstructured data just to consider is if you're gathering data, let's say around social media, what is a user saying about my brand, right? Tweets, Facebook posts, LinkedIn posts, TikTok, etc. Although TikTok would be more video. There you would have to start looking for using tools to label your data where you're looking for specific keywords, for example. You can also do sentiment analysis. But again, you'd have to apply filters on top of that to understand what you're looking for. Whereas if you're looking at structured data, we know that I'm looking for a particular number or for a particular lookup value, and it's much easier to find. I hope that helps. It's kind of a very high level version of it.
Awesome.
But now, so if you're looking for key elements in the data, so that I'm going to use this data, are you not going to have a biased data?
The B word, bias. Did you understand the question?
Oh. So that depends, right? Because I think it's what are you looking for? Essentially, I think the bias can be skewed in both ways. if you're wanting to understand whether there's a negative impression of your brand, I'm going to use a brand as an example, or a positive impression of your brand, then certainly the keywords you choose by which you measure that sentiment is up to you. So I think the bias in data that you're referring to is very common use example, but if you're going to train every single facial recognition tool only on white male faces, then how do you ever expect that training or that model to be able to recognize someone who is isiZulu from Joburg, right? It's just going to be much harder to do. So I think if that for me is where the bias comes in, similarly in how, very good example at the moment, there's a company in South Africa called Botlale. My pronunciation is probably terrible, but what they've done is they've been training models specifically on vernacular languages. And it's fascinating because if you think of all the communication that goes out for Amazon, it's all in English in the US, for example. Now, if you are a retailer or a bank or a mobile phone company in South Africa, you're probably going to find that a larger portion of your audience is either isiZulu or isiXhosa, right? So how do you actually then use chatbots or just basic communication, whether it's email communication in a vernacular language? So AWS does have some models trained on vernacular languages, but not all. So essentially your customer is getting an inferior experience because none of the models that have been trained out there have really been trained on languages that are specific to South Africa. That for me is bias. Whereas we now have companies like the Botlale who are essentially stepping in and doing that. It's really, they've got chatbot technology that does isiXhosa, Zulu, Swahili, etc., and it's changing the landscape. Similarly, Lelapa AI is doing the same. And that for me, how models are being trained and what data is being used to train them is biased. How you apply filters and interpret your data, I think, is essentially up to you and the framework you put in place. But I would be careful as to making sure that that framework also speaks to who in your team are building those. A good example, I mentored a company just last week. I'd never thought about it. These guys are building gaming apps for visually impaired users. So if you are visually impaired, the chances of you being a coder are probably pretty slim. So how do you build a gaming app for someone who can't see? Yet there's so many people out there that also want a companion, also want to be able to play games, etc. So I think it's that idea of how do you put yourself outside of your own requirements, and think of your user requirements and understand how you'd be able to frame that and evaluate your content accordingly or your data accordingly.
Yeah, I believe there's a company in Cape Town that's doing facial recognition for African faces. Are you familiar with them? I'm pulling something out of my memory bank in a throwaway conversation.
We built a facial recognition sign-in tool back in 2018. So we've had a lot of learnings on that.
Yeah.
So there are two components there. The one is physics. The other is training models. So it is really, really important to train models on a very wide training set, right? And that speaks to every culture, creed, you name it, across the world. I know, for example, like Native Americans and subcontinent and Asian and so forth all had a lot of struggles with that because they can't use a lot of the publicly available models through AWS and so forth. That said, the challenges we've run into, we wanted to do this for KFC in Kenya, is we wanted people to be able to use their face to sign into their app so that they could order more KFC. I know capitalism is alive and well, but the important part there is that you really struggle with lighting. So what facial recognition tools do is they essentially pick up data points on your face and work out a mathematical model. And then they have the prediction model of how likely is this face to be a face we've seen before. And your problem there is that if you're in very low lighting conditions, you really struggle because essentially you're not getting enough data points back. So there are companies that are now looking at using light boxes so that when you stand in their store, your face is being recognized and tied to your rewards customer number, for example. But yeah, that's going to remain a problem. I'm now seeing companies do things like palm recognition because actually every single person's palm is unique and you can actually use palm recognition instead to verify.
Cool. Awesome. Any other questions before she goes? Accepting? Not going over what anybody says except for me. Awesome, Catherine, carry on, please.
I don't know how much time I have left. I hope I'm not running over because I do actually have
Yeah.
a little bit of an interactive slide. I'd love to get everybody's ideas. I've got 4 case studies I want to. Yeah.
So we have.
We good? Okay, cool.
We have 35 minutes until lunch break, so we're good.
Oh God, you put me before lunch. Thanks, Greg. All right. Let's continue with data
Don't worry,
analytics.
we just had snacks, so don't worry, we're starting today.
Okay. All right. So the first use case I want to talk about is a data monetization platform that we built for Pick n Pay. Unfortunately, I can't show anybody anything live because all of it is obviously under NDA, but I can speak to you just about the tool that was built and how we did that. So essentially, as a retailer, they had a lot of data. They wanted to be able to make that data available to essentially this middle trade section that I spoke about earlier. And essentially, they wanted to make these services available and be able to charge back on rebates. So what we built was a tool called InfoHub. And a few things that we really had to consider up front was because the data is made available at a category level, each and every one of the vendors had to then have their own login, they had to be verified, they had to permissions had to be set at a category level so that they wouldn't get access to data they wouldn't normally have. And then the different services came into play. So we've built for them services like real estate reports. So as a real estate owner, there are commercial agreements between you and a retailer, and essentially you may or may not get a portion of that income of that store. So you need to be able to have auditable statements at the end of each month in terms of what to charge back. We also built out things like extracts, so the ability to pull POS extracts for data analysts and be able to do their own slicing and dicing of that data. Then there was a service within InfoHub called Customer Insights, which, as I mentioned earlier, are things like shopper loyalty, KPI trends, KPI tree, POP, etc. And that's essentially for vendors to be able to take that data and understand how they can inform their strategies and their marketing strategies specifically moving forward. What was really interesting to see was how building self-service tools and the education required to get vendors to use those tools. And I think that always they're being able to then offer, as I mentioned, a media component very similar to what ShopRite Checkers does is super important because you're essentially taking those insights that they've gleaned and be able to turn them into actionable insights. In this instance, data was pulled from across the business, master data, lookup tables. We had a full data lake, which I'll chat about in a moment. And then also structured data that they would pull in from things like SAP EW, etc. So the key here that was important to build was, think of it like the International Space Station. We had to be able to build docking ports in that whatever the data was and wherever that might come from in the future, they were able to not only import it into the tool, but also be able to convert it into an actionable, usable report, which was about a 3.5-4 year project in total and was really, really interesting. So they ended up with a very secure and scalable platform that they could use to monetize their data. With TFG, we've done quite a lot of data automation. So one of my big surprises is that not all organizations in South Africa, regardless of size, are as automated as one might expect. Right now, actually, we're dealing with a big financial institution who has an issue where a full team of people spend 3 weeks a month analyzing the costs that need to be charged back within the business. So think of your AWS costs, your security costs, your software package costs, etc., etc. 3 weeks a month they're using, basically working on just extracting that data. And it can be anything from opening up a PDF and trying to find a value to importing an Excel spreadsheet, for example. So the idea is to build a data lake into which you can import all of that data and use intelligent document processing. So that can be things like ocular recognition, where you're essentially training the model and telling it to go and look for that specific value and potentially look, for example, for the currency conversion rate, and you're able to pull those together and then map that data and ensure over time that you're getting the same data results, or the correct figures each time. And that automation, I mentioned earlier, how do you upskill your team? We're basically saying to them, when this is done, what are you going to do with 3 weeks of your team's time? And so now that discussion moves into, well, we'll train them up to create reporting and dashboards for each of the business units within the organization. And that's fascinating, right? Because now you're taking those people and helping them do far more valuable work than plowing through spreadsheets and invoices and whatnot. So that's pretty great. With TFG, we help them automate things like their KPI trends, their KPI data, the direct marketing data, and also, I forget the third one, there was a third, KYC data. And that's really and essentially going in and understanding how is that data being treated right now? Which are the use cases for that data? So what does someone like the CEO need to see versus board members versus your data team versus your infotech team versus your marketing team, and putting together all the reporting that's required, and then being able to pull that through into models that essentially automates it and gives you access to that data in real time, versus, again, people sitting down and doing it piecemeal, which, yeah, it's been interesting to see those teams upskill themselves. A tool we've built that we're currently fleshing out internally is a tool called Lynda. There may be some of you familiar with an organization up in Finland called RELEX that do a lot of retail operational tools. We looked at that, and our feeling is that there are quite a number of use cases, not just within retail, but within medical and logistics, etc., where people want to have access to data in real time. It follows a chatbot methodology, if you like, but it essentially pings your own internal data warehouse. So let's say that there is a very big accident on the N2, the nearest hospital is just being flooded with ambulances, and the nurse in charge, or the kind of head of ER, needs to understand how many units of blood do we have in the bank right now. They don't have the ability to look it up on a laptop. They don't necessarily have, someone doesn't necessarily have that information on hand, but they're able to ask either through voice or text how many blood units they have, and get an immediate answer back and trust that that data is correct. Similarly, a logistics company would want to know how many trucks do we have on the road right now, or if you are the CEO of a big retailer, you might want to know what your KPI sales year to date is, versus a floor manager in a store might want to know how many units of milk they sold in the last week. And so this is really just the answer to how you use voice and text enabled tools to help your team internally access data in real time without having to essentially run around and ask 5 different people what the correct answer is. So that's a use case specifically for voice and text. It's also a use case for having a very good and structured data model and an understanding of where your data sits. And it's a use of, now, a couple of years back, it would have been trickier because you'd have to teach people what types of questions to ask. But specifically here with LLMs, where there's that semantic layer where you can ask a question and the LLM can interpret what you're asking it of. But, if there's a way people ask questions could be very different, yet the answer might be the same. I've spoken about data lakes. I'm not sure here if anyone's familiar with data lakes or why they're important. They can kind of be unwieldy and beastly. I see a hand. Whose hand is that?
It's me, Ben.
Oh, hi. Do you mind telling us what you guys have in place?
So I've used data lake in one of the projects, especially in AWS. So
Cool.
yeah, so I know about how it works, and yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, look, I'm a big AWS fangirl, so we love it. Not sure if you're familiar with this. There's a concept of serverless. Serverless, it's probably worth mentioning here, doesn't actually mean you don't have servers. It means you have servers in the cloud and you're not necessarily having to provision those servers yourself. So back in the day, everybody used to have server rooms, and the guys that were white as sheets and basically were standing there just changing out cables in the middle of the night and never saw the sunlight. Those guys basically, essentially their servers have been moved into the cloud. And up until about 2-3 years ago, you essentially had to then do your own predictions around how much capacity from a server perspective you would need. Going serverless means that an entity like AWS essentially does that guesswork for you. So they've taken over the provisioning of all of those servers. It's really useful because if, for example, you have a scenario like Black Friday and you have no idea how much capacity you're going to need, they essentially make that capacity available and spin it up for you and spin it back down so that you're not being charged for additional capacity you might not need. So in the case of Pick n Pay, we built them as far as we know, the first enterprise serverless data lake. And it essentially helped them land all of their POS data, essentially all their structured and unstructured data in the business, and help their internal. We also built what was interesting, because I think one of the biggest challenges with data is there's always a question around how can we trust this data. So we built an automated validation system, and essentially that little engine would go back and check back against the original source and continuously do that throughout the day to make sure that the data that is centralized is always that's just one example of building frameworks around your data to ensure that not just you use the data, but the whole is actually saying that that data is true and correct and can be used. All right, I've put this slide up.
Hold on, just
Yeah,
pause
I think
for a
so.
second. Just pause for a second. Did you guys catch all that? The last bits?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Yeah, sorry, you broke up. Just rewind about 30 seconds and then move on to this slide, please. You see you're
I beg your
picking up.
pardon. Oh, so I was just mentioning that tools. Am I still breaking up?
Yes.
Tools like the
You know what? I hate to say this, but I'll switch off my camera for now. You switch off your camera for now. We'll try it again in a few minutes, okay? That
Okay.
should help.
Okay. I'm on this network, Greg, so if we have issues, I can try and switch.
Why don't you try switching and see if that
Okay.
helps?
Okay, one.
So put in the Amazon Black Friday example. And then
All of them.
where they were.
Yep.
All of it, yeah.
All of them.
Check 1, 2.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Check 1, 2. Greg, we're
Yeah, we
back
can
up.
hear. Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Do I need to reshare or can you still see my screen?
We can still see your screen. You can carry on. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Cool. I think the thing I wanted to mention without getting too technical is that one of the biggest challenges we see organizations face when they adopt a data strategy of any description within the new landscape is that there's invariably a distrust in the data. There's a distrust in whether it's correct. There's a distrust in what the source is and where it's come from. There's a distrust in how it's being used. This is an internal process, right? So let's take KPI data as an example. How that data is being calculated and interpreted and who's using that data and who the consumers are of that data across spectrums in your business can be as different as day and night. And essentially having your entire audience understand how that data has been collected, how it's been extracted and transformed and loaded, and how it's being reported on, and what the sources of that data is really important. And so that change management strategy is as important as part of your digital innovation strategy and your data strategy, as I would say, kind of everybody understanding the business requirements. And so it's just one of the lessons we've had where you can go in and change how things are done for the better, but you still need to bring everyone along on the ride. So it's just what I wanted to close out on, specifically this data lake project.
Awesome. You're loud and clear. Thank you.
Right. So can we try video again? Because I'd love to see the people in the room. I put this slide up because I thought it would be great to go through just some of the examples of where and how data can be used. I'm happy to add examples in, but I thought it'd be nice for everybody here in the room to maybe just before lunch. I'd love to hear your ideas in terms of what types of data do you think can be used for each of these blocks? So let's say personal content and recommendations. And if you have any interesting examples or use cases you think are fascinating. Let me give you an example of mine to kick you off. So let's look at personalized recommendations. I absolutely love abos. There is now a new Googleable fact about me. But what I don't understand is why every single time I go into an online app, like shopping app, for fast-moving consumer goods, why I have to add abos to my cart every single time. You have historical data on me, you have my rewards data, you've seen my buying patterns, you can probably tell when I buy more abos than less. You can also see that I buy things like toilet paper and shampoo at the beginning of the month, but maybe ham and cheese in the middle of the month. So my question is, and it is possible, that if you're able to take shopping data, so app data, as well as rewards data, as well as customer data, you should be able to pre-populate my cart so that everything I want is already in there, and all I have to do is remove the things I don't want rather than having to search for them and add them in every single time. So that's one example of how you could personalize my experience. We spoke about the vernacular languages earlier. If my preference is to be communicated to in Afrikaans, I should have the option to say that and actually get content in Afrikaans as far as marketing messages or service messages are concerned. So that's just two examples of personalized content. But I'd be curious to know within your businesses what you're doing and how you're using data, and if you have any examples to share. If you don't, we can talk more about stuff I know.
Grant has an example, go ahead.
In terms of this one, I'm in the HR space. We are busy looking at or investigating the possibility of having a tool that could help people identify their career paths based on their status in terms of their experience, in terms of their current preferences, in terms of their own makeup. A lot of people think they're destined to become a particular role, but actually their personal makeup doesn't support that. In other words, the psychometric testing. So we'd like to take all those data points that we have. We have lots of data, not just performance data, but also the psychometric data. Align that to the potential career pathing, and then have that totally transparent to both leadership and to the person who's on the path, to be able to give them clear direction on what would best suit in terms of the available roles of the organization, and then what would be required along the way in order to acquire the necessary skills, competencies, etc., experience perhaps, to grow and then achieve those career paths that are best for them.
Did you catch all that, Kathy?
Did actually, and that's really cool. I'd be curious to know, because I'm the irritating kid in class that asks too many questions, but I'd be curious to know if you are also then mapping that to the positions that may become available. In other words, positions you haven't even thought of. Like I'm thinking, I mean, the word prompt engineer didn't exist until a year ago. Now it's already changed. And then similarly, is there also a guiding process to help people understand the jobs they may be suited to, perhaps if it's not even something they've considered like for their future?
Questions. The first question, it's a yes. We've already put the strategy into the layout box and said what talent will we require in the future in order to achieve this strategy. Spat out some really interesting suggestions, some of which were boxes ticked in progress, but there were clearly some gaps. So yes, it would be quite easy, not easy, but it would be possible to align it, and that's a very, very good suggestion. In order to, and I'm sure it would form part of it at the end of the day, when the tool's completely up and running. Second question, not so short. It's a good question. That's- yeah.
There's actually the final slide I'll get to speaks to just some of the tools that I use, our team uses, and so forth. But I saw a really great screenshot of a tweet a while back, which said, AI won't steal your job, but the person using it will. And so it makes me wonder about how organizations are helping. So the big fear around AI taking our jobs is essentially people feeling displaced and not feeling like they are going to have value or purpose anymore. And obviously the real threat of they might not be employed. But I also find that most people don't really know what is possible. And so I think being able to take someone on a journey, how do you design a journey individualized so that that person potentially uncovers that maybe they're really great at sales and they didn't know it, or they're good at creative writing, or I guess what I'm saying is how do you, there will probably be a lot of thought that goes into how do you design that experience, considering it is such a personalized experience for every single person, but be able to have underlying structures and repeatable steps that everybody can go through so that you can also verify that they've all been given the right access, fair access, equal access, etc. So I'd love to hear where you land on that in the future, because that's fascinating.
Chat to you in a year's time.
One of the things we're working on is
Anybody else have?
A broader application of employee engagement. There's two use cases. One is identifying bad bosses. So I come out of corporate, and there's a case started I spoke about yesterday. Is my bosses love me because I'm hitting my targets and I have a pretty decent golf swing and I have a good drinking partner. But my team think I'm a total jerk. They hate me. Identifying those bad bosses, the toxic guys, is actually harder than it sounds. So that I think is easy to do from a data point of view, because you can ask and pull surveys, certain questions, indirect questions about, as your boss that talk to you about your career path and stuff like that. The harder one is predicting employee churn. Now predicting employee resignation. So this is a use case out of the US more than a year ago. You have to have large data sets, I would think. They're so-called contact center retail employees, large numbers of those, cashiers and stuff. But if you have like 100 people sitting in the bank running their core banking system as a consultant, you only have 100. How do you order the models for employee churn? Do you have any ideas around that?
Off the bat, no.
That's fine. That's fine.
Off the bat, no. I was thinking about the churn side. There's a company called Global Kinetic. They actually mostly play in the financial banking space, but because they had an internal need, they've developed a tool for which the name I now forget, so I'll make a note of it. But they wanted to understand why they were churning, and they wanted to see whether they could get ahead of a problem, right? So let's say they're two co-workers that don't necessarily get on in front of their boss, they're pretending to, but when you look at if you do sentiment analysis on the Slack messages between them, or how tickets are being written, or general chatter like on Teams or whatever, they were starting to look for keywords that potentially showed friction and see whether they could step in earlier. And they've seemed to have built something that helps them identify and understand team dynamics almost before the team recognizes that there's an issue. And so they claim, I haven't used their tool, that they've been able to actually reduce churn quite significantly and ensure that team members remain happier, and obviously happy teams are more productive teams. So I don't know if that specifically speaks to your churn issue, but I did think it was interesting, an interesting use of data, and I still have questions around, consent for that data, etc. But an interesting way to try and see if you can predict challenges ahead of time. And I'd be similarly interested if you do that for jobs, right? Because people don't know what they don't know. So how do you help guide them there and show that you've actually given them fair opportunity fair opportunity to be able to reach their full potential.
Awesome.
Like I said.
Nothing? Mr. Pretorius?
Just without getting into numbers and finances and stuff, if you get involved with let's say our company gets involved with a external project with one of our clients, how would one base your finance model on helping your customer to achieve such a project or what, or whether it's internal, let's say your company comes to our company and assist us. How do you charge people for such a project? Because I mean, maybe you make millions of it because you save so much time or you're more productive or whatever. How does AI consultants normally handle these projects without now getting into the detail of the charges?
Should know about possible models of shared risk. Okay,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah, it's
Catherine?
that. So there's actually, I'm going to take a step back and give you an example of how I think a challenge like this could be solved, and then I'll get into how we solve it. I'll try and do it quick because I know we're coming up against time, and I do really want to show you some of the tools. We had a client that came to us and said they have a very large rewards program, and they essentially keep being inundated by external companies who want to partner with them, fuel companies, banking, you name it. And they were saying, we don't know how to assess an opportunity to fully understand whether it's worth us pursuing it or not. And so we went through a full service design process with them where we mapped their current state. We went into personas and who are their users and what are the jobs to be done for each user and what are those pain points for each user and so forth. And that's just one component. But we ended up with a framework that said, what is the opportunity? Who's involved? From a customer lens, what value will it add to our customers? Takes you about 3-4 days just to work through that section. From a technical integration perspective, what would it require? So what systems would need to be included, excluded, adapted, etc. What is the financial modeling around it? Well, how does it save? Do we earn commission? How does it save us time? Does it drive deeper engagement and therefore more sales? So there's a whole financial propensity model for that. We also look at it from a legal perspective, and we look at it through a partner lens. So how do our strategic objectives align? You know, are the two brands supposed to be working together? What are some of the past projects that have worked or not worked? And we built out this framework specifically to assess opportunities within the reward space, but recognize that you can actually use it for any new tool. My boss wants me to use an LLM. Okay, but for what? What's the problem? Why am I doing it? What do we hope to achieve in 5 years? Like if we're writing a press release 5 years from now, what are we saying? We saved X and we employed 5,000 more people and we upskilled 10. What does that look like? So I think everybody's starting to struggle with how do you quantify and validate what you're doing and why you're doing it. Our case is we usually try and determine if we can figure out, because the most important part is if you can't explain your problem, then you're probably not going to be able to solve it. So can we determine what the actual problem is? Can you then look at who's all being affected by that? And then we try and do effort estimations. There's also some amazing tools on AWS, for example, where you can do cost calculators. So you know I'm going to be using this LLM for so many instances on X, Y, and Z, and you can actually build out a cost. Like we've just done a cost estimate for one of the data lakes we're building. Their running costs per month is going to be about $500. So you can get down to that level of granularity. But I think it all depends, you know, I can only speak from our experience, but I know others do it. There are some companies who build at cost and will then share profit. There are others who will build at their own cost and then sell that as a product. Lynda is an example for us. So we would sell that as a product. And then in other instances, it's simply full scope of work, understand what's required, do a cost estimation on that based on experience and just the resources you'll use. And then when you're done, you hand it over and Bob's your uncle. We do find that there's often, because of skills, just a requirement to still do some hand holding because everybody can't be good at everything, right? I'm not a legal expert, so I bring legal people in. But we try and hand over as much as we can because we find the companies that adopt the technology and use it and train their teams on it are far more successful in the long run. You don't want them to be dependent.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Witness?
I want to show you just a couple of tools, may I? I know
sorry,
we've got 5 minutes and you're all probably...
Sorry, before we continue, do you have a hard stop at 12 or can you run over a bit?
I can run over, it all depends on how hungry everybody is.
Guys, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're okay to run over, so we're not gonna be pressed for time. We have a full hour for
Okay,
lunch.
cool. Okay, amazing.
So let's
I
just
wanted to talk about this
let's just
ideation.
let's just finish this round robin and then. Go ahead, witness.
I think in the, just looking at predictive analytics, because I was looking at if there's any tools that might just provide insights and changes in how the market react. Because I was looking at it in the perspective of the products that that one might offer, and if there's any slight, based on the data that you might have, if there's any slight changes in the market, and if the leads that are filtering might then speak into some sort of the changes that are happening in the market specifically. Is there a tool that might look in that aspect?
So the line wasn't very good there, but what I'm understanding you're asking me is it possible to pull in external data sets to be able to juxtapose to the data that you do have so they can measure market trends, for example?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, let me give you a very basic example. I mentioned earlier on that we're looking at building a tool to help with cost analysis and charging back. Now, one factor there is that the exchange rate keeps changing, right? From day to day, from minute to minute. And so you can essentially pull in an external API for a currency converter so that you're getting the most up-to-date currency in that moment. So yes, you can definitely bring those two together. I know, for example, that is it Chase Morgan?
JP Morgan Chase.
Big. Thank you very much. My brain's gone fried. They have, for example, taken all of their own data and essentially built a tool that is their own internal chatbot, but they reference out to all of the market data that's available. So that depending on which data set you're using, like AWS is a great example. Again, if you want to understand their costing, you can integrate their API and essentially pull in their real life data. So it all just depends on what you're trying to measure. But mostly, if you have a reliable data source and they have an available API, you should be able to reference that and use that to inform what you're busy with.
Cool, happy. Ben? Big Ben?
Yeah, on the chatbot and visual assistant, I'm going to talk about the project that I've already spoken about. So in one of our departments, they're using trying to solve the problem where there is lots of due diligence questionnaires. So they're doing the manual work at the moment to try to find out the answers. So what we're doing is that we're bringing AI now to help them because the data is unstructured there.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's what we use. We created a board where they can fill in the form, and then AI will answer the questions. Obviously, they can interpret the answers or not.
Awesome. Did you catch all that, Catherine?
Most of it. Do you have a human in the loop strategy there?
Do I have?
A what?
A human in the loop strategy. In other words, is there an actual human that's cross-referencing the responses that bot is giving? And are you looking at how are you reusing that data to then train the bot to give better and better answers as you move forward?
100%. We have that because what we have seen is that there's hallucination, right? So what we have built is that when you get the response, you can teach to say that this is a good answer and this is a bad answer. So with a good answer, we save it in like Postgres. In this instance, we use a Microsoft. And then the next time when you search for the same answer, we know that we get the good answer.
Yeah. So one of my favorite things about using chatbot technology, if done well, is you can use that reinforcement learning, and you can actually have your customers inadvertently, or your users, I should say, inadvertently train that model on your behalf. Just a simple thumbs up, thumbs down, this question helped. If they give you a thumbs down, you can have a little pop-up that says, you know, which one of these, what didn't give me the right answer, or I expected something different or other, and they can expand on that. So people are actually very willing to help if you're just willing to tell them it's in beta.
Awesome. Wayne?
Mine is in intelligent automation, where I've got a university that is looking to do student tracking But the issue is that their data is not complete because they turn off validation, because there's a sentiment that professors are there to teach and not to input data. And then you're sitting with a situation where data integrity is an issue. Now, I've heard you talk about developing validation apps and everything, but how do you kind of deal with that? Because you've got to come up with, and the complexity is even more because you're dealing with NSFAS-funded students. So your complexity about student tracking is not just about at a social level, or it's actually deeper. It goes all the way to affordability, where you come from, what's your background, etc., etc. And so it's just complexity based on complexity. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to have a quick dashboard to look at student tracking. Where are we? Are we,
Student tracking in
that's-
terms of learning.
Well, everything, it cuts across. So it's essentially learning, but what are the impacts of not learning?
Cool.
Is it just their learning experience, or you're also finding that you're struggling to get data from them? In other words, they're not willing to give up more information.
Well, it's exactly that. The reality is that at some levels you can't even reach them to be able to get the data. Because of location. Some students are in very remote sites, don't have access to data. And yes, at some levels we try to give data, and people are being incentivized to using cellular technology and that, but it's generally not working that well, because it's also being exploited by students. They are not using, you would give them data, but they're not using it for teaching and learning. They're using it for their own consumption. So it's a repetitive process.
So I'm going to give you two quick examples to illustrate the point. The first is not a project I worked on, but actually a project one of our service design lead worked on out of West Africa, where they had West African diaspora that would move, for example, to France. It was very specific to France. And so what you'd have is kids who've left home, they've moved to Paris, they're earning money, but their parents are still stuck in like Benin and Mauritania and so forth. And they're having to send money back to help those parents with their medical bills. Now, what happens is that once they got down onto the ground and they were like, how do we make this product work? How do we help these people in Paris actually like buy an insurance product that will look after their parents? The problem was that the parents didn't want to ask the children for money. So they would end up only calling them when things were absolutely dire. And the children kept feeling like there was this responsibility and this like, I've left home, this guilt. But that only came out when you understood what kind of the human drivers were around why people would or wouldn't use this product. These guys were like, oh, we'll just build insurance and everyone will buy it and everyone will be happy. So I illustrate that because I want to get to the second project, one we're busy with now, and I can't say too much about, but it's essentially building out a consent and preference management tool. Now, if you look at, I'm the world's biggest unsubscriber to everything. I'm even on the Direct Marketing Association's okay. But we've been thinking a lot, we're very early days, but we're mapping what type of data is currently being captured about the users that we have. And then secondly, how do we design an experience that actually encourages them to give us more data, right? So what are the incentives for them to give us more data? It could be better customer experience, could be personalized, etc. But we're starting to think, instead of just changing how you ask people for data, like, do you want to be, can we use your data? Can't we? What language do you want? And so forth. We're trying to see if we can unpack the whole thing and get down to what would drive someone to actually give me more information. How do I incentivize that behavior to give me more because they can see an upside on the other end? So I'm not saying you're not doing it, but I'd be curious to know if you did a study with students, those who give you data and those, by data here, I don't mean airtime, I mean their personal data that can help you track them. What would help them give you more? So what are their drivers? And how do you build that trust that the data you've got on them actually helps them with their learning outcome? Because surely they're there to learn, right? Like they're not, yes, they're there to party, but they're also there to learn. And so that would be my question to you is what ground up are you doing? And you can go to companies like Moya, for example, who do very grassroots research, and get them to put a survey together for you to help understand what would drive a student to give you more data. So I think your problem would be probably the collection of that data before you can even use that data. Anyway, again, I'm just spitting off the cuff here, but anyone else?
Do you have more slides? Do you have more stuff to go through?
Yeah, real quick.
Awesome.
I wanted to show you this slide. So I'm just going to quickly break out. I will share these and I'll also hyperlink them for you. The first thing I wanted to show you is there's a really cool ChatGPT tool built by the same collective intelligence team out of MIT called Apta. And it's essentially a tool to help you understand whether AI is usable in your project or not, which is super cool. So I just asked one question of it, like, is reporting of KPI data for a retailer a good use case? And you can see the very first question it's asked me is to expand on my question, and it actually takes you through a workflow, and eventually will then give you examples of how you could or could not apply AI. So I'm not going to do a full case study now, but really, really worthwhile looking at. Similarly, gentleman who just spoke last, you could, for example, say, is there a way for me in which I can use AI to drive more willing adoption of content sharing or of data sharing, for example, amongst students? And it can help you figure out whether you can ask those questions. So it's a great, I think of it as a second brain, and it's a great way to kind of validate upfront if they're use cases. Secondly, there's a super cool tool called Party Rock, which is driven by Amazon. I know you guys had an Amazon speaker yesterday, so you may be familiar with this. Very easy to use. It builds on all of the models, so Claude, Gemini, GPT, you name it. And you can essentially build your own little apps driven by LLMs, and you can change out the widgets. And it's, if you then go deeper and you're actually in developer space, you can use Bedrock, which this is based on. But if you wanted to build a quick POC, Party Rock is like dummy proof. It's really, really cool tool to use. Another one that I find fascinating, I was hoping to have time to take you through a use case of it. Unfortunately, it is still not loading. Unfortunately, it is still in beta, but it's MIT's Supermind Ideator. So it helps you, just see if I can get this up. Different screen, there we go. So Supermind Ideator is a way to help you frame questions and also explore problems. It is a demo after all, so it's not working. I apologize. But Supermind Ideator is really worth looking at. There's also a very cool resource that Futures 2030, which is kind of this concept of a collective intelligence, and it looks at over 30 scenarios for how technology and specifically AI could be incorporated into business use cases, from medical to finance to, you know, people management, etc., and kind of help spark ideas around what is possible and what the technology that's available today would be able to do in the future. So Futures 2030 is really worth looking at. And then finally, a newsletter I cannot recommend highly enough, comes out every Sunday morning, is a newsletter by Azim Azar called Exponential View. So every Sunday morning, it's kind of, I lose my mornings to it, but really speaks around all the exponential technologies out there, what's happening from renewable energies to large language models to chip making, etc., and just the impact of that technology on the business sphere. It's a good read, and it's well worth digging into on a Sunday morning. I'm sorry that Ideator is not working, but I can put a demo together and share it with Greg so you guys can see it. But it is worth signing up for it, and it's an amazing way to spark ideas and to interrogate whether a problem is actually solvable or not. So just worth taking a look. I will now stop talking because that was enough.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. One of the things I want to tell, first of all, thank you.
Welcome.
One of the things I want to explore after lunch is a concept of selling into enterprise concept called builders, buyers, and believers, not in that order. I was actually at a breakfast the other day. And somebody had a question about how to sell enterprise, and the guy says, "Oh yeah, there's believers, builders and buyers. What does that mean? Believers are your champions. So we're working on the project where we have a champion. Then you have the builders, the people that actually use the products on a day-to-day basis, and the buyers are the ones that sign the checks. And you actually have to structure your presentation, your pitch, or your persuasion around all three of those things. So after lunch, we can talk about how to deal with, that's not just selling to an enterprise, but also selling an idea within enterprise. How to deal with resistance to change, which is 100% going to happen with every AI project. So in closing, before you run off, any ideas around that? How to deal with resistance?
Take people along for the ride. If you include people from the get-go and they feel like they've had agency and they feel like they've actually had the ability to give input and be heard, you'll find that they're far more amenable to accepting that. I find the best way to have people accepting ideas when they think it's their own.
Yeah, I've learned that to set aside your ego and say, oh, Wayne, great idea you had last week. Let's run with this. Brilliant. Catherine, thank you so much. That was brilliant. I'd like to give this token of appreciation for your visits to Gibbs Business School. I'm going to hand this over to you. You can reach out your hands out and accept it, and I'll give it back to Gibbs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for spending time with me. Take care.
All right. Have an awesome afternoon. I'll send you the recording of this after I put it on you. I'll put it on unlisted YouTube so make it easier to transfer. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.